Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 37 of the Future of Work show, where we discuss ideas that are playing a role in influencing the creation of a new future of work. Now, across different episodes this whole past year, we featured a variety of different ideas, right from the impact technology is going to have around the way we work to the changing ideas around leadership, culture, and organization. As some of you know, I'm the founder of Uncube, where I, along with my co founder Papia, work with organizations to help build the new workplaces of tomorrow, what we would like to call Workplace 2.0. And along with partnering with organizations in designing this new Workplace 2.0, we also offer education and advisory services around managing in the hybrid workplace. So before we get started on today's show, one quick announcement from me. Uncube and Harappa Education have partnered to create a digital-only program on managing in the hybrid workplace, and that's going to be out in just a few weeks. It's a really good program. It's a great place to go if you want to educate a large number of managers in your organization on how to manage in what's going to be a dramatically different workplace. So with that introduction, let's get started on the topic of today. Is the future of work going to be more transparent? And I'm going to introduce you to two amazing women, Amber and Ariella. Amber is actually going to be joining us in just a few minutes, but I'm going to give you their introduction. And with that, I'm welcoming Ariella onto the show. Hi, Ariella.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Thank you so much. So, Ariella and Amber are the founders of Lioness, which is a New York based media company that does something which is quite unusual and has been creating waves around the world. So, their work was recently featured in the New York Times because what they do is they help people who have faced misconduct, abuse, harassment at work tell their stories. Now, as many of us are aware, many organizations across the world have NDAs, which make such disclosure actually rather tricky. So, Amber and Ariella work with people who have faced misconduct, harassment, abuse, and help them tell their stories in the public in a way that doesn't hurt them and yet helps to bring about change. And in today's conversation, we're going to dive right in and try and understand what are some of the ideas and ways with which Lioness works. So with that, Ariella, my first question, I know that I've seen in your career trajectory, you have spent a lot of time trying to help both organizations and individuals tell their story. And from whatever I've read about your work, you seem to have a special preference for helping people who are in need tell their stories in ways that are generally accessible only to the most powerful and well-connected executives. So can you share a little bit about what was your motivation when you were setting up Lioness?
Sure. So my background is actually in, as you mentioned, public relations for larger companies and organizations, largely in the tech world. And as I was building my career in that realm, I really started to understand just how powerful narrative is and how important it was for these companies to hire experts in this field to help them control the narrative and manage their reputations. And years in, I thought to myself, what if this were more broadly democratized to people, to everyday people? Your average person obviously doesn't have the resources of a large company to shape a narrative in the press. But sometimes, as we're finding, especially with workplace issues, the court of public opinion is a lot more powerful in actually making change than the court of law. Because in the court of law, it's really a David versus Goliath battle, and that whoever has the most money usually ends up getting what they want, even if they have to give a little bit of money to somebody to make them shut up. So I thought, what if we could provide this as a service to people who really needed it, who wanted to use the press as a means to change their workplace or change the culture. And we take a really journalistic approach to it as well, where we're kind of like middle women between the press and people. People come to us, we hear them out. We do have to do a bit of fact checking ourselves. because the press does lend a lot of legitimacy to somebody's story as opposed to just going to Twitter or Instagram and posting. You actually have to be vetted to get into the press. So we walk people through what that means, what kind of information they need to get together, and we help them bring that story forward with connections that I built over the years that I spent in tech PR. And I think it's powerful for people, to be able to shape the narrative and tell their story in their own words, or try to guide a reporter or a news organization toward a different perspective. And not a lot of people know how to do it. I mean, it's hard to tell your own story and to look, inward and, map that out for yourself. So we try to help people figure out how to do that.
That's really interesting. And I've heard you speak about the importance of telling a good story and how difficult it is for, most of us to understand what parts of our story are perhaps likely to connect, really well with the outside world. Are there any tips that you'd like to share around, what really creates an impact as a story? I mean, obviously a true story, and I know you vet it and you do your due diligence and make sure that whatever is being shared is factually correct. But are there some general guidelines that go into making a story connect?
Yeah, I think as it relates to the workplace specifically, because I know that this conversation is more about the workplace, you do need to have evidence. So if you're to say, this manager said this to me, or this manager made these people feel this way, are there other people who can corroborate that? And they don't have to do it on the record with the journalist. They can just speak, on background, which means that their names are not implicated. Do they have emails? Do they have Slack messages? Anything that shows, because what companies will try to do, especially if it's just one person, is paint that person as like the disgruntled former employee who potentially didn't fit in. I don't know if you read, there was an article in the New York Times a few weeks back about all of these women at Google who were speaking up about mistreatment. And they were basically just told, like, you need mental health counseling and the problem is on you, not the organization. And then they all sort of banded together and they were like, well, all of us have the same experience. So are all of us crazy? Or is it Google that's, culturally problematic in some ways? So I think to be able to have corroboration in the form of other people or evidence, to look at it as clinically as you can, which can be hard because these are very emotional, high stakes situations. When you think about people's workplace issues, it goes straight to like their dignity and, their entire purpose. So people do get very emotional, understandably, about it. But I would just urge people to be as clinical as possible because that does lead to, the best set of facts to help the journalist really understand what's happening. And of course, they can explain how it is that a situation made them feel and what it did to their lives. Um, but I think just mapping out all the different facts and also, tethering it to what other people may be facing in other workplaces or what other people are facing in their own workplaces, I think is very powerful to show that it's, a societal issue, a cultural issue, and not just some sort of spat between a manager and an employee. And if it is just that, I will say, if it's just like, oh, you have a bad boss who once said something mean to you, it's not newsworthy. There definitely has to be, a broader trend, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of somebody enabling some sort of environment that's harming others, to make it newsworthy. But unfortunately, there are a lot of those situations that we're hearing of.
Those are some really good pointers, Ariella. I hear you speak about the importance of being clinical and factual, then
Mm-hmm.
the importance of it establishing a trend or a pattern that isn't just about one individual's experience, but about, broader swath of the organization and how it connects. And I hear you speak about the importance of, bringing evidence, but also corroboration from many others who've experienced something like this, because that's what makes it then, a story worth telling, that it's not about an individual manager and an individual employee, but it's about a pattern within an organization. And, you spoke about Google, organizations like Google and many of the other organizations which have been in the news for similar reasons of the last few years, are actually extremely powerful organizations with the kind of PR advisory machinery, legal advisory machinery that few individuals would probably have access to. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around, how does one sort of even the balance, given, just how much risk an individual takes when they're coming out and telling their story versus, really the stakes for an organization?
Oh, I mean, the risk for the individual is just so much higher, from a financial and economic and social perspective. I mean, it's much, much easier just generally in life, just to fit in. um, and I think that for people who are taking that risk, a lot of times we get the question, like, just how risky is it? And there's really no way to game that out, because you don't know how, you know, there's so many different ways the company could react. Worst case scenario, they do sue you if you've signed an agreement. We haven't really seen that happen, because usually the stories are so airtight that for the companies to then go ahead and sue this lone person, especially if they're like multi-billion-dollar companies, it's just a really bad look for the company. But it's a financial risk, it's an emotional risk, it's a social risk, because that person is really going out on a limb to call out and expose something that's happening at an organization, and they don't know what that means for their career, and can they ever go back into that industry again if they're seen as a troublemaker? Can they recover financially from it? I do think that the people who we work with who decide to go forward, they're usually like extremely emotionally strong. Like, they have, whether they've been in therapy or talked to family and friends, or have some sort of financial safety net, they have a lot of conviction in what they're doing. There's no wavering. It's not like, oh, but if I say it this way, could I maybe get a job at this company after I whistleblow? Like, it's usually like, I have conviction that this is what I want to say. And this is why I want to say it. And there's so many reasons for why that person is the way they are, how they were raised. Maybe it happened to them in past workplace experiences and they're just fed up. But yeah, it's a tremendous amount of risk. Whereas for the company, they have money. I mean, they have lots of money to pay law firms to defend them, and, PR spin people to defend them. And it's not to say companies shouldn't be able to defend themselves. Like, just because you're powerful doesn't mean you shouldn't have the right to defend yourself, but you just have so much more money to be able to achieve that it's just like incredibly lopsided. And the way it works is that the individuals usually, or they try to squash, which may sound like a dramatic word, but I think they really do try to squash that individual and that dissent, and paint it in whatever way they can as like, this person is a thorn in the side of the organization, a thorn in the side of progress, a troublemaker. You know, there are tactics that they can use to discredit that person as well. So it's definitely scary stuff. It's not for the faint of heart. People who go and do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. And, if we just read our comments, Papia has joined in. Hi, Papia. And she speaks about how telling your story to the world required loads of courage, reactions from society and the workplace. And I have a follow-on question on this as well. The other observation is that there's a pattern of branding disgruntled employees as performance problem cases, where performance issues might actually be arising because of the organizational climate itself. So is that something you see quite often? That
yeah, there's something called a performance improvement plan that a lot of HR departments will use to, like, if somebody is being troublesome, they'll this person could be very intelligent and contributed a lot to the organization, but the HR departments will essentially say, like, you are a low performer, and they'll give you some sort of unreasonable, like, milestones to make in order to keep your job. This actually happened to me once before, where they were like, you have a week to achieve what's in this plan. And I'd never in my life been put on a performance improvement plan before. I was like, what is going on? I think they just don't like me. But and like, that's a way to basically like show people the door and say, like, it's your performance issues. They don't want to admit what's really going on. So that is a good point.
Yeah, yeah. And, you spoke about how people who you work with have tons of courage. And
Mm-hmm.
you found that for reasons which are perhaps sometimes very personal, they are the ones who stay the course and, don't start doubting themselves despite the fact that it is so difficult. Let me ask you, are you seeing a shift in the way organizations respond to some of these allegations? For instance, with the Me Too movement, etc. Have there been shifts in organizations becoming more open to this feedback, or do you think we are pretty much where we've always been?
I think there's been progress. I think sometimes with the really large companies, it's hard because they don't really have an incentive to change, or they'll treat it in fluffy ways where they'll provide people with like very cushy salaries and benefits, which is like, it's not to say that that's not important either for employees, but they'll treat it that way as opposed to dealing with some of like the more entrenched issues that people um, might want to be talking about. But I think there has been some progress. I think that part of it is people are afraid, or companies are afraid of a reputational issue. So they know that this is a possibility, that employees can now come out, and that people are becoming more bold and breaking NDAs and non-disparagement agreements. And I think that
Yeah.
that frightens companies, especially if they're very rich companies or rich people, because maybe they don't care about the money, but they care about their legacy. They really care about their legacy. So perhaps that is causing a change. But it really is coming. I think the change is coming from the outside, and it has to come from the outside, I believe. And then companies will either follow new policies that are formed as a result of that outside pressure, or outside press, and they're they will change. But I think it's incremental.
So I hear you saying that there have been some shifts. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
there are also strong reasons for organizations to care a lot about the press that they receive, and individuals to care a lot about their own professional legacy. And it's those factors that are influencing organizations' responsiveness. And yet, you are pointing out the fact that some of these shifts have to come from the outside. So I'm curious about your thoughts around some of the legality. So you spoke a while back about the fact that so many employees sign non-disclosure agreements. Obviously, NDAs were set in for a very, very different purpose when they were started. It was to protect trade secrets and sensitive organizational information, but they can often be used to make it very difficult for people to share some of their actual experiences. And we saw that in the Me Too movement in California, at least, there was some, amendments or new laws which allowed people to state factual information that happened, even if that went against their NDAs. Do you think that we're going to see more of that? It is going to become more and more legally available for people to speak out against misconduct or abuse despite their NDAs?
I do think so. I mean, I think the California law is the first step, and there are so many companies headquartered in California, and that could have ramifications for their employees in other areas. Um, I do think that some very progressive companies may even start to adopt language like this that isn't legally mandated or required for them, but they want to basically signal or telegraph to their employees that they care about these issues. So they're going to um, put more progressive clauses into their contracts. But I do think it's going to change because I think a lot of people are fed up. And it's not to say that corporate power will never, that will always be there and that will always be an interest. And of course, naturally, they sort of have to push back against the needs of every individual. But I think that in order to keep the peace with a lot of people who are demanding more autonomy and power and transparency, as this conversation is about in the workplace, companies will start to adopt some of these provisions into their, agreements with employees, or maybe they don't even have NDAs. The woman who's actually spearheading that legislation is a woman named Ifoma Ozoma, and her point is like, why do we even need NDAs? Can't we just have confidentiality clauses? And how weird is it and almost dystopian that you would sign a piece of paper that would almost, in a way, like forcibly erase part of your memory about an experience. How weird is that to basically, there in some of these agreements, you can't even share what happened to you or something that you observed to your spouse or your partner or your family. So I think her point in this entire campaign is kind of that this is this is strange and there are other ways that we can address this to protect trade secrets and to protect competitive information. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are erasing parts of their memories or histories or backstories in order to progress through the workforce.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I think you make a very, very good point that it's California where some of these changes have originated, because California is home to, so many important tech companies, and is often at the forefront of what maybe will follow across the world. So I think that's a
Yeah.
really, really good point that you made. I was wondering, Ariella, what are your thoughts around do you think the future of work is going to be more transparent, just because it's really, really hard today to, squash views, given social media, etc. We have, of course, Glassdoor, for instance, where employees can, share their own experiences. There's another app called Volt, which perhaps you're also familiar with, where you can in real time record any abuse or harassment you are facing, and do it anonymously, and at least it gives you feedback on how many others have experienced something similar in your organization or with your boss, perhaps. And of course, there is, for instance, the kind of work that you are doing. All of these seem to point towards a future where organizations understand that the future of work is way more transparent than any time in the past. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that there has always been a sort of whisper network about companies and organizations, and that has existed for a long time, even before some of these platforms sprung up. But I do think that these platforms and press and all of these labor movements definitely give more space for this information to be shared and formally shared, because before it was just sort of
Yeah.
like, oh, did you hear about the CEO of such and such? And, he really likes women or whatever. um, and it was a little bit
Yeah.
more kind of people whispering to each other at the office. And now I
Mm.
think it's definitely becoming more above board and people are being a little bit more honest about what's happening. I do think that with everything, if there's a shift toward transparency, um, companies are going to try and recalibrate that toward the center where they're, of course, they don't want every single employee sharing every single piece of information about their performance reviews, their micro interactions with their managers or people who they work with. Like, that's like so much information that I think in their perspective, nothing would get done if we were all just talking about like what's behind the scenes all the time. So I think in response to like some of this hyper transparency, the companies will um, make an effort to find some middle ground. Um, but I think it is better that people aren't living in like a shroud of secrecy in the workplace, and that we do find that middle ground where people are able to make decisions for themselves and know who they're working for, and um, what their company really stands for, while still being able to like function productively at work. So yeah, I do think that